Co-founder and co-leader of our firm's Psychedelic and Emerging Therapies practice group. Thank you for joining our program today. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. And to report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. Presenting with me today is Natasha Sumner. Natasha is co-founder and co-leader of the firm's Psychedelic and Emerging Therapies practice group, along with me and Karen Luong. I'm a former research scientist, which gives me a unique perspective in the emerging areas of law, such as psychedelic therapeutics. My work involves being a problem solver and regulatory compliance advisor for innovators and clinicians engaged in the research and commercialization of novel therapies, and I'm inspired and motivated by the potential use of psychedelic therapeutics to treat debilitating mental health conditions such as PTSD. Natasha advises clients on regulatory matters inherent in new drug development. She also advises behavioral health clients on compliance matters, and she approaches her practice with great passion for the promise of psychedelics and other new drugs. She's well-versed in historical and current psychedelic research, including recent FDA-approved studies on MDMA and psilocybin use for mental health and end-of-life issues, the legalization and decriminalization of psilocybin in numerous cities, states, and biotech and pharmaceutical research. And with that, I'm going to have Natasha get us started.
All right. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kim. So we're really glad to be here today to talk for about an hour, maybe a little bit less, and hopefully we can get some questions in to talk about Schedule I clinical research and some trends that we're seeing this year and probably beyond. As many of you know, as many of you may know what psychedelic therapy is, but we will go through just very briefly what psychedelic therapy is. We will briefly mention some of the psychedelic clinical trials that are happening right now, particularly with different psychedelics. And we'll then kind of move on and talk about clinical trial research generally and some of the issues that we're seeing more generally, and then we will talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. So, all right, so what is psychedelic therapy? You see here a picture of somebody with a eye mask on, and there's two folks sitting on either side of her, and so they are typically therapists. And she will take either MDMA, psilocybin, maybe ketamine, and then it's kind of an internal experience often, and the two folks on either side of her are there to assist her as she is dealing with whatever is coming up. And so just keep this photograph kind of in mind, because we will talk a little bit about it again when we talk about the challenges of doing psychedelic clinical trials. And here we have just a brief overview of the different clinical trials that are happening right now with psychedelics. And I think this just shows that it's not just mental health. There are clinical trials going on for things like fibromyalgia and chronic pain and those sort of things. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of all of this research. And I just wanted to mention one thing, because I didn't know this statistic, but I think it is important to mention because we're talking more generally about clinical trials, that 90% of clinical trials fail to move past phase 1. So we may not see all of these down the road. All right, so I'm going to pass this off to my esteemed colleague here, and she's going to talk about the requirements that are different than other scheduled drugs for Schedule I drugs.
Thanks, Natasha. And so just to launch us into Schedule 1 substances, that folks that want to test Schedule 1 substances in clinical trials, it involves several regulatory agencies. So both the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the FDA, as well as any state and local laws where applicable in your area. But the FDA has understood that there is going to be this need for the agencies to interact. They have a manual that establishes responsibilities and procedures between controlled substances staff within CEDAR, and that's within the FDA, to review the research protocols that are sent by the DEA. And I'm going to cover that a little bit later. The DEA will get a copy of your IND as part of your application process for a license. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but likewise, and because there's interagency kind of coordination that has to occur, the DEA has more recently dedicated a web portal for submitting applications in order to conduct research on Schedule 1 substances. And just as a reminder to everyone, a substance that's undergoing a clinical trial or approved for specific use is not broadly cleared, so to speak, by the FDA. So that is to say, that formulation, if it gets FDA approval, that formulation of that Schedule 1 substance generally is approved, but not the entire substance altogether. Anyway, if anyone has questions about that, I'm more than happy to discuss later. Okay, here is I'm going to go a little bit into the nitty gritty of licensure with the DEA for Schedule 1 drugs. So the only time a Schedule 1 drug can be legally used is through research. And so on the left here, you'll see the DEA form 225. Some of you might be familiar with having to fill this form out. Only entities who handle the drug are required to be registrants. And what I'm referring to is sometimes we get the question of, well, this entity, right, the sponsor is a division of this parent company. The division is going to be, the sponsor is going to be handling the scheduled substance. They need to be DEA registrants and need to apply, fill out Form 225. But does the parent corporation need to? In that case, no. Only as long as the parent's not handling it in any way, storing it, shipping it, or anything. So anyway, for clinicians and researchers, they're first required to submit an IND to the FDA. An IND is an Investigational New Drug application. And for anyone to conduct research with a Schedule 1 drug, they have to obtain this Form 225 license from the DEA, which is applicable for manufacturers, distributors, importers, exporters, canine handlers, and researchers. So also something that's not on the slide that I wanted folks to keep in mind is that you must also follow state licensing requirements. Some states will have their own licensure requirements for Schedule 1 drugs, or any scheduled drug for that matter. All the laws must be complied with in order to legally research the drug. And just so folks know, a background check of the applicant will be conducted. And as I mentioned before, an IND will also need to be submitted along with this form. But also something that Natasha will be covering is your protocol that you are using will need to be IRB approved, which is Institutional Review Board approved. And then we'll go into that a little bit later. You also need to, provide a statement on security provisions that you will have on site. A vault, for instance, in order to keep your Schedule 1 drug under proper security within the eyes of the DEA. And also, just each 225 application is accompanied by a fee. We can get into that. We're not going to get into that in that presentation. There's a number of fees depending on what your use is with a Schedule 1 drug. And generally, the application fees are not refundable.
And what are you seeing right now in terms of time period for the DEA review?
Oh, that's right. So if your site is trying to get the Schedule 1 licensure for the first time, that can take a while. So we're telling our clients it can take over a year. It requires site visits and possible remodeling of your location and that sort of thing, because it has to be secure in a vault. But if your site already has a Schedule 1 license, then the investigator or whoever is potentially handling the drug will need this licensure, and that could take 4 to 12 weeks. So it's not as bad. Thanks, Natasha. Okay, and we're going to, so what happens after you submit this 225? I've actually pulled a flow chart from DEA's researcher's manual. This is the 2022 research manual. It's that tells you what happens to your application once the DEA receives it. So your application is received, goes to the DEA headquarters located in Springfield, Virginia, and it gets reviewed for completeness. And then it undergoes 2 reviews, one by FDA or /CDER for review of the protocol as well as competency of the researcher. And the DEA field office of wherever your facility is sitting will review it for security requirements. And then after those 2 reviews are completed, it goes back to headquarters and you'll be issued a license or not. So DEA has authority to deny, suspend, or revoke DEA registration if any of these things on this slide happen. So if you materially falsified anything on the application, if you were convicted for a felony relating to controlled substance or any list 1 chemical under the CSA, if you had your state license or registration suspended, revoked, or denied by a state authority, and you're no longer authorized by state law to manufacture, distribute, or dispense a controlled substance, or you had some kind of other suspension, revocation, or denial of the registration recommended by a state authority. If you commit an act that would render the DEA registration inconsistent with public interest is also another reason, and that could be a little bit harder to fight since it's a more ambiguous reason that they may give you. Another reason that they may exclude you is that if you excluded from having a license, from being provided with a license, is that if you've been excluded from participation in a Medicare or state healthcare program. Other reasons for denial are things like storage, access, or shipping issues with a controlled substance, and lack of experience in the distribution of controlled substances is another potential reason. Okay, so we now assume with this slide, we're going to go into preclinical development. So assuming you have the DEA licensure to research your drug and just to go into preclinical studies. And this is not, so just so you know, preclinical studies do not require FDA authorization. So this is before you do your IND to the FDA. So a preclinical study they're generally studies in animals, but I'm going to go into a little bit later about some examples where you may not need to show animal studies. You need to show that you need to provide evidence to the FDA, or this is what you have to plan for in your preclinical studies, is that you will eventually use this as evidence that your drug is reasonably safe for use in clinical trials for human experimentation. You've also provide evidence that established safety for the FDA to approve the protocol that you're about to, all this feeds into the IND. So
you don't need FDA approval to do the preclinical study, but it is required.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. Yes, that's exactly it. So certain types of animal research are governed by the Animal Welfare Act and U.S. Department of Agricultural Regulation. But I'm about to go into the FDA Modernization Act of 2.0, which was just signed into law December 29th, 2022. So this is brand new. This encourages the use of in vitro cellular and organ systems rather than animal testing for preclinical work. This is an amendment to the FDA regulations, but it doesn't exclude or call for a reduction of animal testing. It basically just broadens the availability of using these alternatives in support of providing preclinical work to show safety and toxicity and pharmacologic activity of your drug that could be used possibly by, you could possibly show it by cell-based assays or new technologies such as organ on a chip, which are microfluidic devices lined with human cells, or these 3D tissue cultures that serve as in vitro kind of miniaturized and simplified organ models. They're willing to open up it's not restricted to animal models any longer. So I'm going to launch in here. Some folks might know about this. In order to run your clinical trials with Schedule I substances or with any substance, this actually is applicable to all substances undergoing clinical trial work. you need to have a GMP certified product. So GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices, which are a system for ensuring that products are consistently produced and controlled according to certain quality standards. It's designed to minimize the risks involved in any pharmaceutical production that cannot be eliminated through testing the final product, such as incorrect labeling or contamination of products, that's a big one, or incorrect levels of the active ingredient. So investigational products, either natural or synthetic, must be sourced and manufactured at GMP and GLP certified facilities. I didn't really go into GLP in this slide, but GLP is good laboratory practices, which we can go into with anyone who's interested. But so GMP ensures reliability and consistent production. And this might seem straightforward, but you may run into anticipated issues. And below here is an example of a recent psychedelic that's undergoing clinical trials, where the sponsor found out that MDMA is a very static molecule that needed encapsulation, proper encapsulation in order to prevent it from unintentional sticking and probably changing of the active ingredient that goes out. So they had to go to several manufacturers before they found one that was a GMP certified lab that could deliver a reliably pure compound for use in clinical trials. Some folks may be well aware of this, but as a reminder, the clinical trial process is timely and costly. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar process. There's a lot of interaction with different agencies, FDA and DEA, and your local agencies as well, state agencies. There's 4 clinical trial processes, and there could be lots of complications that arise between sponsors, supplier of the drug, investigators that need to move, and that sort of thing. And just FYI, if your investigator moves, the Schedule 1 licensure will also need to be reapplied for. So you're going to want to think through that kind of carefully if you're a Schedule 1, if you're trying to do a clinical trial with a Schedule 1 drug. But there's opportunities for a faster timeline, such as breakthrough therapy and priority review. And I'm just going to go over some statistics that might bring this home a little bit from a 2016 Journal of Health Economics article that gave us some interesting numbers over this. So the estimated likelihood that a drug which enters clinical testing that will be eventually approved by the FDA is less than 12%. It's 11.83%. And the estimated time from start of clinical testing to submission of either your NDA, which is your new drug application, or BLA, which is your biologic licensing application, is 80.8 months. That's a lot of years. And so for a total estimated out-of-pocket R&D cost per new drug of $1.4 billion. And that is 2016 numbers.
And just briefly going back to the breakthrough therapy, I think for those of you who are interested in Schedule 1 research, MDMA and psilocybin have been designated as breakthrough therapy for certain indications. And so I think that shows, of course, I will shorten the time, but I think it shows the FDA's willingness to open up trials for these Schedule 1 drugs.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Natasha.
All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about why clinical trials are so expensive and the process that drugs go through. As many of you know, there are a lot of different parties involved in clinical research. You have your sponsor, your investigator, and your IRB that Kim just mentioned, the Institutional Review Board. Now, the sponsor typically is, usually a large company, sometimes a smaller biotech company, but they are the person that wants to do big research, essentially. They are also often financially responsible, most often financially responsible for the trial. And sometimes you do have the sponsor as the investigator, typically if costs are an issue. Then the investigator, of course, is the person who is conducting the clinical trial. And then you've got your IRB board. And the IRB is required by statute. And the main purpose of an IRB is to protect the study subjects. So I'm sure for those of you that do clinical trial work, the main concern always is the safety of the patient. And the IRB is really important because they make or break your clinical trial. They approve the protocol, they can require modifications, and they could also disapprove the research. And you also have many folks use what we call CROs, contract research organizations, and basically they kind of take over the responsibilities of the sponsor. But one thing to keep in mind is that the sponsor is still responsible for ensuring the quality and integrity of the clinical trial. And then you've got your monitor who basically ensures that the data is properly collected and recording. We all know who the subject is. And so this just shows the amount of different responsibility that a sponsor has, filing and maintaining the IND, making sure that the investigator is qualified, not just generally, but qualified for this particular study, keeping records, of course, monitoring the trial, progress, and then, any communications that the FDA wants, the sponsor will often need to be involved in that. And then you've got your investigator, who also has a lot of responsibility because they are really conducting the trial. So the most important thing, of course, is to make sure that the protocol is being followed, the protocol that has been approved by the IRB. And then if any modifications need to be made, that has to go through, for the most part, through the IRB. So it's always important to, check with them and make sure that if there are modifications needed, even very small ones, you need to understand whether or not you need that IRB approval. All right. And so here we talked about the IRB, and again, this is why it's really important to pick the right IRB. Now, first and foremost, the IRB has to be registered with HHS, and actually they have a website that shows all the different IRBs that have been registered. However, that does not mean that any of those IRBs on that site are qualified for the study that you're wanting to do. So again, really making sure that you pick the right IRB, because they are going to then ultimately be approving or disapproving your protocol, the investigator, informed consent, which is always, always, always important. And then the advertising materials, what goes out to the public, so to speak, to get subjects in for the clinical trial. Because, at the end of the day, if the IRB is not the right IRB, the study will likely, and the drug will likely not be approved. And we mentioned this before, so I basically already talked about this, but, again, any changes in the research, you need IRB approval. There's a couple of exceptions to that where there's, something that's necessary to eliminate any kind of harm to the subject. And again, must be registered with the HHS, very important, and they maintain and document compliance with policies that are consistent with federal regulations. So I'm going to pass this back off to Kim to talk a little bit about good clinical practice.
Thanks, Natasha. So good clinical practice, why is good clinical practice important? You may have heard of clinical trials being held that is stopped after an audit. And holds can happen for many reasons, including studies that fail to adhere to good clinical practice, or GCP. So GCP is an internationally accepted scientific and ethical quality standard for the design, conduct, performance, auditing, record keeping, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials. So it's to protect the rights of human subjects participating in the clinical trial and to ensure the scientific validity and credibility of the data that's being generated from these studies. And as you'll see, that this is going to be an ongoing theme with our talk and just throughout the regulations in general. The rights, safety, and well-being of the trial subject are the most important considerations overall. So the FDA has adopted the International Conference on Harmonization, GCP guidance, in April 1996. And then so which was incorporated into the FDA guidelines. So to get the updated latest version, you would seek the GCP guidance from March 2018. And you should read these guidelines and apply them to the context of your work, such as informed consent. That's going to be another consistent theme that we're going to be harping on here. And good clinical practice encompasses informed consent. So each subject must provide legally effective informed consent prior to participating in the study unless waived by the IRB, which I'm not going to get into. We really want you to practice good informed consent and keep that in mind. The consent can't include exculpatory language, which seems to waive any legal rights that the subject may have. And it has to be more than a document. It can't be coercive. They must be provided in language that's understandable to the subject, and the subject must be given an opportunity to discuss the study with others before consenting, and they must be given an opportunity to have any questions answered about the study prior to consenting, and as well as be provided a copy of the signed and dated consent form after they've given their consent. And the consent must also include information such as that the data collected during the study may be disclosed to other entities, such as the sponsor, the IRB, FDA, other regulatory bodies, and that sort of thing.
And just keep in mind, too, that clinical research is exempt from HIPAA, but I think including language, is a good idea. And I think particularly for Schedule I, right, you have a very vulnerable subject. Because they've taken this drug that's putting them in an altered state.
That's it. Yes, that's an excellent point. And the vulnerability of these psychoactive compounds is something that we're going to touch on a little bit later. But yes, that's definitely something to keep in mind and of utmost importance. So we're just going to backtrack a little bit as to why are all these rules. We're just in the middle. We're about to go into a few more rules after this. But human experimentation that we call clinical trials, it has a dark history when there were no laws or regulations or oversight about who was being experimented on or what the goals of the investigation were, or if there were any goals. The Nuremberg doctors' trials of 1946 brought to light the horrible, unethical experiments that were done during World War II to victims that the Nazis held captive. Some of the experiments included sterilization, exposure to mustard gas, burning with incendiary bombs, infections to various diseases such as tuberculosis and typhus. And even outside the context of war, there was unethical and immoral studies that have gone on, including the syphilis study at Tuskegee, which started in 1936, which involved 600 Black men who were told that they were being treated for bad blood, when in fact they were not given any treatment at all. Even when penicillin became the treatment of choice for syphilis in 1943, they were not given any treatment at all until 1972. When the study came to light in the public media. Okay, so now I'm going to bring us back to the rules in the clinical trial process. And this has been alluded to earlier in our presentation, the IND, the Investigational New Drug Application. So your IND must contain information in three broad areas, like the animal or alternatives, as I mentioned earlier, under the FDA Modernization Act 2.0. So those will be studies that encompass pharmacology and toxicology studies of your investigational drug, and manufacturing information and clinical protocols and investigational information. So the animal, this part about the pharmaceutical and toxicology studies need not only be animal studies, it could also include any previous experience with the drug in humans, which is often foreign data. And in terms of manufacturing information to include in your IND, you will need to include information pertaining to the composition, manufacturer, stability, and controls that were used for the manufacturing of the drug product or drug substance. And the FDA must be ensured somehow that the sponsor has the capability of adequately producing and supplying consistent batches of the investigational drug. In terms of clinical protocols and investigator information to provide detailed protocols for the proposed clinical studies will need to be included that will address whether the subjects will be exposed to any unnecessary risks, which is that term again in terms of good clinical GCP, good clinical practice. So the information, the qualifications of the clinical investigator need to be also included as part of the IND. And there must be commitments to obtain informed consent from the research subjects in order to obtain review of the study by the IRB, as well as to adhere to the IND regulations. So once this IND is submitted, the sponsor has to wait 30 calendar days before initiating any trials.
And that's during that 30 days is when the FDA is reviewing the IND, particularly for safety, right?
Yes, yes. So the prior slides were applicable to most clinical trials. This slide covers some of the aspects of clinical trial design specific to psychedelics or psychoactive compounds. So I'm going to refer you back to slide number 3 that Natasha covered with a participant who was lying down with eye shades and with the investigators sitting on either side, or at least the psychedelic sitters were sitting on either side monitoring the administration of the psychedelic. So some of these points here on the slide address the specific risks in psychedelic clinical trials. One of the things that comes up a lot in psychedelic clinical trials is active placebos. So the double-blinded studies where neither the participant nor the physician know who's getting the placebo or who's getting treatment are gold standard in clinical trials, but that might be difficult to achieve in a psychedelic trial, where it's possible to actually experience a trip under a placebo, but I think it sounds unusual according to the literature. So it's one of those things that some of the things other people have tried and you want to consider when designing your trial is to use a microdose or low dose of your active form of your drug, as well as maybe even a physiological kind of active control such as niacin might be something to consider to kind of hedge against the idea that people know, either physician or the participant know that they're either on placebo or on the treatment. And you want to be careful about controlling the setting under which you administer a psychoactive compound. So a medical monitoring is best practice, and no bunk beds, for instance. We didn't see any in slide number 3 that Natasha went over, and safe surroundings. And that's kind of what was illustrated in slide number 3 with lighting, temperature, music, sound, and making sure it's a secure facility, not only for the drug, but for the participant, and making sure that you capture the data that meets regulatory requirements. And that might be, I'm going to go a little bit into that, how that is going to might be a little bit difficult just because for a lot of behavioral health type of clinical trials, the endpoint's not physiological.
Yeah, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the length of these particular therapy sessions are anywhere between 6 and 8 hours. Yes. Right? I mean, if anyone knows and understands how psychoactive compounds affect folks, these are not short visits and short trips, as they're called, except for ketamine. Ketamine usually is about an hour.
Yes. Or DMT, which is also being investigated, right. The much shorter acting compound. So that'll be something that you have to build into your design is just understanding the pharmacology of your drug that you're testing.
Right, and that's why the security is really important, because it's such a long period of time where somebody's under the influence.
Yes, yes. So I mentioned in the previous slide that some of the design challenges for psychoactive compounds, if you're designing to treat a behavioral health condition, such as, and this is just broadly speaking, such as depression or PTSD, you're going to be not relying necessarily on physiologic measures, or with an oncology drug, you're measuring where their drug shrank or disappeared, or something that's objective. We're going to be dealing with more subjective endpoints, which can be a little bit more difficult of a design challenge. So some of the ones I have listed here are self-administered questionnaires, where you give the subject who has undergone the treatment questionnaires, and then those can be questionnaires that address visual scale, whether they're seeing visually, and mental well-being assessments, how are they feeling, a challenging experience questionnaire if they're feeling a challenging experience, and any kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness consciousness or any emotional breakthroughs could be part of your questionnaire. Mystical experience or psychological insight questionnaires are kind of included in this first bullet point. And some other endpoints you might want to consider are observer-administered measurements, like going back to slide number 3 that Natasha went over. There were 2 observers in that case, and that could be where the observer is asking, observing whether the subject seems anxious or aggressive or whatever kind of mood they seem to be in, asking them open-ended questions, and maybe giving the observer a monitor rating questionnaire so that something is written down in addition to the whatever answers are to the open-ended questions they deliver. You can also deliver cognitive tests to your subject, during or after, or however you design your clinical trial, which could include parent-associated learning, digital symbol substitution testing, or choice reaction testing. And we recommend that physiologic measures also be taken, even in behavioral health. This is a new modality, so this is behavioral health with a drug. And so with any kind of drug, you do want to do physiologic measures such as blood pressure, heart rate, because you want to check for adverse events.
Absolutely. And we do know that serotonin, drugs that affect the serotonin receptors can often also affect your heart and other things over short or probably long time period as well. So, it's important to kind of keep those in mind.
Right. So some of the new things coming through on clinical trial design are the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act of 2022. This is just an acknowledgement that clinical trial design continues to evolve. Researchers and the FDA have recognized that there's a disparity of studying health effects in heterogeneous populations that have been encouraged, and they have now been encouraged by the legislator through the passage of FDORA to develop ways of increasing diversity within clinical trials. So for decades, research has demonstrated persistent disparities in health, access to healthcare, and health outcomes that are based on race, ethnicity, age, sex, gender, socioeconomic status, and other factors. So there's been a renewed commitment to promote health equity and close the gaps that are in healthcare access, quality, and outcomes for these patient populations that come, starting at the clinical trial level. So this is hopefully going to be decentralizing. It's encouraging the decentralization of trials, which Natasha is going to cover a little bit later in her slides, streamline clinical trials. So right now, what it states is that sponsors will be required to submit diversity action plans for certain late-stage drug trials, including all stage 3 clinical trials, as well as most device trials. So there will be a draft guidance due by the FDA in December 29, 2023, later this year.
So Kim mentioned decentralized trials, and so that's kind of a newer term, I think, for folks. And basically what that is studies that are being done using technology. So things like telemedicine, we all have heard that term, and also have like mobile or local healthcare providers, and then just using technologies and processes that are different from what is been traditional. The FDA, keeping in mind the FDA regulations, they don't specify the type of trial a sponsor must conduct. And so, you can do a traditional, a decentralized, or even like a hybrid of the two. And for the regulations that cover this, you can find them at 21 CFR 312.5 for drugs and biologics, and 21 CFR 812.40 for medical devices. And some of the there are, potentially some concerns, things like HIPAA and data privacy and security and things like that, because you are using newer technologies. Kim mentioned novel endpoints. So I think folks are now looking at what are these endpoints, not just for psychedelics, but I think more generally. And then using data that's being collected in a passive way. So something that is like a wearable device that the person wears, but they don't have to do anything. It's just the data is just being collected. And that's now possible with all the new technology.
I'm really excited about this development, Natasha, because I knew someone who decades ago participated in a trial and then it was ongoing, right? It's multiple weeks. So he had to travel to the East Coast for work, and he experienced an adverse event and was prevented from seeing, asked, well, can't I just see someone here local so I don't have to lose my job here? And no, they forced him to come back. There was no such thing as a remote, this remote thing was not a thing at all. Right. They would have dropped him out of the trial, and then they would have lost him as a data point.
Yep,
so.
Yep, and that's a good point. I think this is why the diversity and the decentralized are really important, because you're also, he maybe had the ability to travel if he needed to, but many people, of course, don't have the ability to do that for various reasons, socioeconomic. Maybe they have a disability and things like that. So this is going to, I think, promote obviously a more diverse group who's being studied, and also maybe the dropout rate will be less. And so just kind of continuing on with some alternative trial designs, we've got using real world data. That's very hard to say. The 21st Century Cures Act, which is Section 505F to the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. And pursuant to this section, the FDA has created a framework for real world evidence, using real world evidence, RWE, that's a little easier to say. And basically that's data that is derived from sources that, are other than like traditional clinical trials. And the FDA does have a long history of using what we're currently calling real world data or real world evidence to monitor and evaluate the post-market safety of drugs. I'm sure that many of you have read, something in the news about, a drug that seemed safe, but when it was approved and then taken later on, was deemed to be unsafe and even maybe taken off the market. So this real world data could be really, really important. And then here, the second one down, doing a trial in a healthcare setting. That's, I think, sort of interesting. So there was something called the Reduce MRSA trial, and it was conducted in 74 ICUs in 43 hospitals and involved nearly 75,000 patients in 16 states. And what they were doing was evaluating the effectiveness of 3 common MRSA prevention practices. So, not all trials will be able to do this in a hospital setting. And as it says here, it's not all or nothing. So maybe there's a way to integrate that so that you can have a much larger population that's being studied, and it may also keep costs down potentially. And then this last one, master protocol, I think is kind of interesting, where they're simultaneously evaluating more than one investigational drug and or more than one disease type within the same overall trial structure. And if you want to know a little bit more about this, you can go on the FDA's website. They have a guidance. This was initially created for oncology and biologics. So you can check out, they have a guidance document from March 2022 that I think is interesting, and I would like to see how this might be something that could be used in psychedelics more often. And then the last thing that I just want to mention here is Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which was co-founded by Duke University and the FDA. They're working together to sort of create these alternative trial designs and promote that more. So you can also go on their website. It's very interesting, and they have a lot of interesting ideas. And Kim, I'm going to pass this off to you to talk a little bit about AI and technology.
Oh, just continuing on the theme of trials that we're seeing in clinical, trends that we're seeing in clinical trials, excuse me. So I'm going to go a little bit, not too deep, into the AI. So AI is a term that probably a lot of you has been heard about because it's in the news quite a bit. It promises to affect many aspects of our lives, including how it can be used to improve clinical trials. So AI is short for artificial intelligence, which is the machine simulation of human intelligence processes, which include learning, reasoning, and self-correction. ML is short for machine learning, which is the scientific study of algorithms that build a mathematical model of sample data to make predictions or decisions without being explicitly programmed to perform a task. So ML is often considered a branch of AI. So the ultimate goal of AI is to build a machine that can perceive the world and make decisions the same way humans do. It has the potential to transform a number of clinical trial key steps of clinical trial design. So people have been using it already for research and preclinical applications. A lot of this is things like computer modeling that could be used to predict novel sites for binding for potential drugs that could be more selective, and hopefully leading to more effective drug targeting and increasing the therapeutic efficacy and reducing side effects. That's the hope of using things like AI at that stage. It could be also used to automatically monitor, collect, and analyze real-world evidence, real-world data from participants in the clinical trial, which may help make decentralized clinical trials possible. And it could perform complex analyses, such as combining your phase 1 and phase 2 trial data, or assist with patient recruitment, such as improving your patient trial matching, monitoring your patients automatically and continuously during the trial, and thereby hopefully allowing adherence to the trial protocols and yielding more reliable and efficient endpoint assessments. I mean, everyone's thinking the sky's the limit, but one of the things to think through with AI is informed consent. That is, as with all aspects of the clinical trial process, you need informed consent. If you're going to be using AI in your clinical trial, you need to think through about how much you need to educate the average technology user in order to achieve actual informed consent. If the data that you're generating is being used by this AI technology for research, is your consent broad enough to allow for that use? And AI has evolving properties, which increases the complexity around this issue. So it's vulnerable to bias and ethical issues, and as well as privacy and security issues. It's also subject to a patchwork of regulation. It's new, but there are things that regulate this. So the states are trying to regulate AI and privacy issues. The FTC, that is the Federal Trade Commission, is likely to be more active in AI issues, as well as the Office of Civil Rights in HHS, Human Health Services, is also concerned about the bias that's related to any, AI issues.
Yeah, I think that bias is actually really, really important. The technology is only as good as the person who's creating the code, or, I'm not a techie person, but so these biases can be built in, not intentionally, but because of just the person who is, designing this.
Yes. Yes,
Right.
as our understanding is that it's a data set that feeds into the AI that could be really critical.
Yep.
So one of the things that if you're a clinical researcher, you're going to think through: is the population that you're doing your testing on indicative of the population you're trying to treat ultimately at the end? That's going to be pretty critical.
Yeah.
So just to cover this is kind of like an all-encompassing slide that talks about risks in general at clinical trial sites. And this is just a few of them. There's more risks than this that this slide captures, but you're going to want to make sure that you have the requisite licensure for your site, as well as all personnel have the requisite training, qualifications in order to run the trial. And we attorneys like to also harp a lot on whether you have proper insurance, because there are a number of clinicians we've run into that were hopeful that just their medical malpractice insurance would be adequate. And we don't recommend just that. You would need to look beyond medical malpractice insurance and maybe think about things such as professional indemnity, product liability insurance, that sort of thing. So this square here about adequate policies and procedures for controlled substances is something that probably all drug sponsors need to be worried about. You need to have the right SOPs and make sure that you have things ready in case of an audit. So all the things about shipping, handling, who's handling, who has access, when do they have access, who was administered the drug and when, and what does your security look like, type of thing, the physical security look like. And yeah, it's going to be pretty critical in the event of an audit.
And this right here is, again, I think a good time to mention that sponsors, I said this earlier, but they're ultimately responsible for the clinical trial. So insurance and things that could happen during the clinical trial process. Now, there are clinical trial agreements, and that's way beyond this scope of this talk. But if you have questions about that, you could, of course, reach out to us. But that's just keeping in mind the sponsor is always ultimately responsible, which is why we put this slide out.
Yeah. And overall, and not last but not least, is patient safety as a risk. And we're not talking about just physical safety, but also psychological safety. Psychedelics, just to go back to psychedelics for a minute, psychedelics are generally seen as relatively safe and well tolerated, but there's some adverse effects such as, fatigue, insomnia, headaches, nausea, and possibly other effects. They tend to be transient in nature, but it's just something you want to consider. And you also want to consider some of the physical effects as well, because some of the psychedelics have been reported in the literature that to possibly have long-term effects, cardiotoxic effects, such as chronic 5-HT2B agonism that could affect your heart. For instance, since there's serotonin receptors all over the body, including the heart, is something you want to keep in mind of. That seems to be more of a long-term issue, not all the trials that we're going through right now they're not considering long-term use. But anyway, another thing to keep in mind is the vulnerability of the patient that was alluded to earlier while they're under the influence of psychedelics. It's just something you want to be really careful with, because we have seen lawsuits and things in the news and such things like that associated with this.
So this is our last slide, and then it looks like we may have a few minutes for questions. But I put this in here because it may be applicable to psychedelics. So psilocybin, as many of you know, is magic mushrooms. So the trials that have been going on, for the most part, have been synthetic psilocybin, so generated in a lab. But there is maybe a possibility for using psilocybin that is natural, that's grown, the mushrooms are grown. And so this botanical drug guideline would apply to that, published in December 2016. And I thought this was interesting, but there are actually only 2 FDA-approved botanical drugs. And I didn't dig into this in any deep way, but I imagine it may be because it is very difficult to get a consistent therapeutic effect across the batches, sometimes with even one batch, right? So the active ingredient in psilocybin, it varies in the mushroom itself. So which is why these trials are using synthetic psilocybin. However, there are a couple of trials going on right now by Filament Health using natural mushrooms. So it'll be interesting to see if how this plays out and whether or not we'll see any FDA-approved trials with natural psilocybin that ultimately gets approved. So, and with that, we will take questions. We have a few minutes here, so if anybody has any questions, we would love to. It looks like we do have some questions here.
Okay. The first question is, are the trials generally double-blinded? And if you're talking about psychedelics, my understanding is that, yes, they are double-blinded.
Right.
And there's a number of them out there in scientific literature, but they attempt to be double-blinded.
Yeah, right.
So, is my understanding. And let's see.
And trials generally are often double-blinded, just outside of Schedule I drugs.
Just right. Yeah, that answer is not restricted just to Schedule I drugs.
Yeah.
Let's see. The other question I have is, does the DEA dictate what is included in the informed consent process? More specifically, free medical care for trial-related injuries, harm. Medical care for trial-related injuries. Oh, are you saying, I think you were saying, does the informed consent need to state that if you're injured because of something related to the trial, like have a heart, I guess, like arrhythmia or something like that, that you would be, I don't think that would be dictated by the DEA. The informed consent process is more towards, I believe it's regulated by the FDA.
The FDA,
This is not the DEA that will be concerned with that. The DEA is going to be mostly concerned with the whole drug supply chain.
Yep.
So whether it's secure, whether you have the proper paperwork in place to, account for all tablets or milliliters of your drug or whatever, however, powder, whatever you're using, micrograms of your drug. That's what the DA is going to be mostly concerned with. But yeah, informed consent, that'll be something, if you're worried about providing free medical care, that'd be something I believe you would be working with your IRB with, in terms of trying to hammer out the details about that. But we'd be more than happy to discuss this with you offline.
And I think there's a question here. Can you elaborate more on IND versus BLA? So the IND is for drugs, and the BLA is for biologics. And biologics have a very different process that they go through. I'm not the scientist here, but the biologics are very different from drugs.
She knows a lot of science, though.
So there is a different process, and we would be happy to, if you want to reach out to us separately, we can, by email, we can give you a little more information on that. But those are two very, very different processes.
They're different. They tend to be parallel in a lot of respects, but there are some key differences. But yeah, that's kind of the outside scope of our talk for the time being. Are there any other questions? And while we're waiting for possibly any other questions, I would like to mention that if you're interested in hearing more about psychedelics in clinical trial work, Natasha and I and Karen Lewong, along with two other of our industry partners, will be delivering a workshop in May in San Francisco at the Psychedelic Therapeutics and Drug Discovery Conference. If anyone's interested, that's not free. This is free, but that workshop will not be free. But if you're interested in hearing more about the conference, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be through, I can give you more information. That's no problem. We also have a lot of articles about clinical trial work and a lot about psychedelics. I don't know. I think the audience seems to be kind of split between whether they're more focused on clinical trials in general versus psychedelic work. But we'd be happy, just contact us. We'd be happy to forward you any articles or the links to our articles at any time. And also, please contact us with any comments or ideas for future webinars that you may be interested in hearing about. And plus, we love talking about psychedelics all day.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. I mean, I think just to mention, we really do actually believe very much in this, yes. And it's near and dear to our heart. And we do work outside of the psychedelic clinical trial work, but that's where our heart is. So. Looks like we have, let's see, a couple more questions. I think we can answer maybe one or two.
Oh, is it possible to utilize drugs that are manufactured in non-U.S. jurisdiction? Yes. So the key thing about that is that it will have to be a GMP process that you're using, and you'll have to demonstrate to the FDA that this is they following that this non-U.S. jurisdiction is following GMP, and that might require a site visit from FDA out to that site, sort of thing. But that's all FDA driven, and that will definitely come back to you because you have to demonstrate. If you're going to submit an IND, you're going to have to produce all the documentation, and there might be a couple of inspections. If it's a new site, in a non-U.S. jurisdiction to manufacture the drug of interest that you're trying to study. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're actually out of time. I'm going to have to close this out. Please, everyone who's answered, asked us questions, we'll follow up with you via email. Thank you for all of your interest. Thank you for joining us today. And we're hoping that all this information was helpful to you and your organization. And as a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. It's short, because we use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs, so we would appreciate that. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.